Dread Delusion was a game I wishlisted a long time ago, based almost entirely on the screenshots, and unfortunately I find myself with some mixed feelings towards it now that I've actually got my hands on it. On the whole, I do actually like this game, but I think it's important to temper expectations, both because it is an indie developer's first game and not a full-priced one at that. I enjoyed it because I felt it was sufficiently carried by its world, atmosphere, and art style. But if you're someone who's looking for dodge rolls and iframes, I can confidently say this game isn't for you. It sort of reminds me of that old debate: what matters more, story or gameplay? And where you fall on that is going to be your biggest decider as to whether this game is worth it or not. I have often seen the idea being thrown around that this is synthwave Morrowind, and if you're talking about the gameplay, that sentiment holds no truth at all. Morrowind is a deep RPG with plenty of mechanics set in a huge open area. Dread Delusion isn't. The comparison comes from the art style, the unapologetic unusual world building, and the fact that they have big bloody robots. Morrowind comes from a wonderful time, before Todd Howard saw Lord of the Rings. As a result, it's full of weird and wonderful elements. The world feels very alien. Dread Delusion doesn't have a Todd Howard at all, and as a result, it too fully embraces its kooky and unique world building, while successfully walking the fine line between the odd and the truly nonsensical. The setting is built around the world after the God War, where the Apostatic Union rose up against the gods. They felt that the gods often made unfair deals that favoured themselves, through what are supposed to be the impartial mediators of the Wiccans, but these deals often required some sort of cruel blood sacrifice. Although that wasn't always the case. Sometimes there were relatively benign gods, but the Apostatic Union really didn't care too much for the details, and simply deleted anything godlike with a spear to the brain. Which, well-intentioned or not, has been a bit of a problem for the Ontheric Isles. Many communities relied heavily on the gods to maintain even some basic forms of existence, whether or not the god was cruel. Now those communities are crumbling, crops are failing, and plagues are spreading. Wiccans and god worship is on the rise, and the Inquisition is cracking down hard. All the while they are promising supply and support that may never come to these relatively backwater islands. This is only a summary of the first section of the game. As the story continues to unfold, you'll explore new islands with their own feels and themes, that still tie nicely into the setting. And it is into this setting that you are dropped, tasked with hunting down a woman hell-bent on righting the wrongs of this world and creating her own heaven, no matter the cost. You can ignore the plight of these isles and focus on your quarry, but if you choose to intervene, your actions can change fate forever. I was absolutely hooked by the first village. A brief walkthrough of the first few areas will introduce you to all the core concepts. The Inquisition with its 40k-esque feel, the Wiccans, and the Gods' War, as well as some fun little things, like mushrooms that can show you the future, and a set of scales that can be used to weigh your character, as in your personality, against the absolute pinnacle of society and ethics in the Apostatic Union. It's all very cool, and more than once did I see something off in the distance and have a real desire to drop everything and go check it out, which is actually not a feeling I get very often in open world games. It's normally objective to objective for me. The first was rounding this corner to see this massive chained up monster. It sets a really good tone for the game. In fact, I consider it one of its greatest strengths. When you stop and look around the game world, the environments make good use of vertical spaces within the admittedly confined areas to give you a good look at loads of different points of interest. And when you turn your eyes up to the skyline, there's something always suitably eye-catching. It's not just a mountain, it's a mountain with a flying undead worm circling it. I don't think often, if ever, I felt disappointed in taking the time to go off and explore in this game. Largely speaking, I feel the scope and the pace of the game is pretty sound. The world is broken up into 3 reasonably sized islands, with a few smaller ones floating off out in the void. Whenever I felt myself getting tired of one, the game was wrapping up the story in that area and was sweeping me off to the next. Overall, it's a short game with only a handful of quests per island. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, as the restrained size keeps things in focus and no quest felt particularly superfluous or boring. And a fair few will come with some sort of story-based decision to make, some of which were genuinely difficult to know what the right thing to do was. And, of course, the art style is the heart and soul of this game. I was sucked in as soon as I saw it, as I've already hinted at. As you can tell, it's made a deeply stylistic choice that I really adore. It looks good and will give the game some longevity over attempting to obtain something more realistic. It's very evocative of games like Thief, the original Soul Reaver, and yes, Morrowind. Also great because it allows for some really unique designs that make the game feel quite special. This, for example, is a goblin, and it's definitely a memorable take. And this thing is just very, very cool. Unfortunately, the game lets itself down in the mechanical departments. Frankly, it's quite dull. Not horribly painful, just dull. Combat is a simple light, heavy, block and parry system, but all it takes to be an expert is to walk in, swing, and walk back to dodge the enemy's attack. The only time I even died on my very first run, although a few enemies did get me close once or twice, was because I asked that age-old question, does this game have fall damage? And yes it does. The enemies are in quite a dire state too. It was pretty cool to see the various designs the game can offer on a visual level, but it will quickly become apparent that they are all basically the same. And, by extension, the same circle strafe tactic works on all of them. I mean, if you're feeling fancy, by all means try a parry, but it's a hell of a lot faster just to blitz in and out. Enemies are also pretty reliably giving out consumables on death, meaning you're never going to find yourself wanting for anything. And that's before taking into account all the other items scattered around the map. Fortunately, combat is entirely optional. The only boss fight in the game can be dealt with without a fight, so you can sidestep the issue. You might be tempted to try and defend this by saying combat isn't the point, and to a certain extent I understand that. But in a game where combat is secondary, it has to actually be secondary to something, usually a solid system offering an alternative that is the real foundation of the game. Take, for example, Thief. It has a combat system, but that's really there for emergencies. The game is really propped up by a deep stealth system requiring forethought and expertise. Unfortunately, for Dread Delusion, the no kills, get past everyone path isn't gratifying either, because like combat, it also doesn't require any skill, as I'll talk about more in a moment. You might counter that by saying story is the focus, not combat or stealth. Again, to a certain extent I agree, it's certainly what I enjoy the game most for, but this isn't like a visual novel or something. These are systems that run through the moment-to-moment gameplay, and they feel so underwhelming. Unfortunately, because so many of the mechanics are simple, and I mean that about more than just the combat, the skill system feels very lacking. Leveling up will give you access to a point to put into an attribute, and each major attribute governs a few minor skills. Your might attribute, first and foremost, covers how hard you can hit something. Obviously, that primarily is going to apply to combat, and it certainly helps end fights quicker. But I think that if you're going to go the combat route, you can get by easily enough by just staying on top of weapon upgrades. Guile covers your lockpick skill, but the real benefit of the Guile skill is the boost to your agility, giving you a bonus to jump distance and run speed. And you can really zip about by the end. While extremely useful as you can get wherever you need to be very quickly, I think it would be a mistake to overinvest in this stat on your first run. The lockpick is fine, but with this speed boost, at a certain point you'll stop feeling like you're part of the world, and instead feel like you're passing by it. Also, this is the alternative to combat, not stealth as I really implied. You can outpace anything in the game very comfortably, and with killing being entirely optional, it's almost the optimal choice. There's no reason not to do it, and you can then dodge the tedious elements of the combat. But I do think it is going to damage the game experience to some degree if you do this for your first playthrough. Wisdom governs all the magic stuff. Obviously, mana and spellcasting comes under this banner. It's a different combat style, probably best used in combination with at least some form of melee weapon. But pure magic does appear viable. One of its skills, lore, also helps you pick out hidden mechanisms to open secret doors. This process basically boils down to running around like a headless chicken, looking for one of the half a dozen assets which are used for hidden switches, then hoping your lore skill is high enough to actually activate it. Again, it's a serviceable mechanic, but a bit disappointing. And finally, your personality determines prices through your barter skill, and also your ability to persuade folk into doing something. it is perhaps the weakest skill in the game overall. Not that any of them are particularly standout. Barter isn't all that valuable because combat is laughable. No real need to buy any consumables on a regular basis, bar maybe a few items when you first set out. There are a few opportunities to convince people into helping you, saving a wee bit of time, but dropping the skill entirely won't really have much of an impact. Your build is never really going to offer you any particularly novel or different solutions to quests or dilemmas, with a few small exceptions. For example, you will never utilise your lore skill to uncover hidden knowledge and break a curse, or your charm to find a peaceful solution between groups. Instead, what you're really going to be considering when picking your skills is how you're going to want to open doors. This game relies strangely heavily on the locked door. Obviously, some need keys, but every skill has their own way of opening doors where applicable. Strength characters can knock down rotten and broken ones. Lore builds can look for hidden levers. Your classic rogues can pick the locks. And even charm characters can chat their way through some of them, which is one of the most bard rolled a nat 20 things I can think of. Not all approaches will work for all doors. Especially the really hidden doors are only openable with lore. But a lot of the time, if you're lacking in one skill, another will have you covered. To the game's credit, having multiple approaches to a problem is good game design, and to a certain extent helps make your character build stand apart a little. But it doesn't feel like you're exercising a meaningful choice, when the solution is often expressed through a single button click that will get you through the same door and to the same prize. It's really strange that as I look back on this game and ask myself what was most affected by my skills, it's not combat, stealth, or barter. It's doors. And even then, often it felt like the choice didn't matter. Speaking of which, the lockpick skill, unlike all others, is a random chance roll, but the higher your skill levels, the better chance you have at success. Why on earth was this a choice? Every other skill does this via a hard check. You've either got it or you don't. But lockpicking is on the whims of fate. It's either very frustrating or very boring to sit and watch a dice roll decide if you're getting in. This is not engaging gameplay. But it means that even if you don't have any other way of opening doors, there's always a small chance you'll get in so long as you have lockpicks, which you will because the world is scattered with lockpicks and monster drops. I think it's intended to be a sort of safety mechanism, which, to be fair, did save me once at an essential door right at the very end of the game. Not every door is going to have a lock to pick, although a hell of a lot of them will. So I mostly feel like this safety net further devalues build choice, because you can brute force your way through a lot of them. These are all the components that contribute to that mechanically dull experience. Since the game is relatively short, these issues are kept from spiralling into something truly disastrous because you don't really have to engage with them for a long time. But it can harm the game in the long run, if you're looking for something with replayability. After my second go around, I had experienced what the game had to offer in terms of story, for the most part. And without a solid base of mechanics, the game now feels exhausted. If its core gameplay could stand up to a little more scrutiny, there could be something worth coming back to again, carried by the moment-to-moment encounters. But as it is, it feels like it's really limited itself. Equipment is also a bit of a consideration, but it's more neutral on the mechanics front. Unsurprisingly, I like them for the Dark Souls style lore drop in the description. The most important element of your equipment is probably your weapon. You can find various rusty versions throughout the game, and using the appropriate ores, they can be upgraded to unlock their potential. Keeping on top of this is easy and well worth doing. If you don't, the already unchallenging fighting can become a true slog as you can't output enough damage. Second most important is the armour and helmet, which gives you defense obviously, but also a boost to your skills. Useful if you're lacking lore to open a hidden door, for example, or maybe boost your agility if you're feeling too slow. However, this might also somewhat undercut the skill system. You can get so much from your higher tier armours that it further makes your choices feel redundant. Despite its mechanical flaws, I really loved Dread Delusion. It has managed to capture a rather enchanting feeling of discovery and charm. But if you're going to buy this game and enjoy it, it's going to have to be off the back of the atmosphere and world building. For me, that was certainly enough, and I really enjoyed my time with it. But I understand the appeal may be a touch niche, and can be overshadowed by the mechanical issues, so I can't give it a blanket recommendation. If you are considering buying it for the world and the art style, then I think I can safely say go for it. Full price is less than £16, and for what you get, I think it's a bit of a steal in my opinion. I didn't really bring it up in the review, but eventually you'll get yourself an airship. Far too late into the game in my opinion, but there you go. I don't know what, if anything, will take place in the Dread Delusion universe in the future, but I can hardly imagine a better setting for a sky pirate adventure game. Hopping from island to island to experience new wonderful places is a solid base to a game. There's even a few places mentioned in the game that sound like they would fit the bill nicely, but that's probably getting a bit ahead of things. The game's only really just out in the grand scheme, so I guess we'll just have to wait and see.